A single line, tucked inside chapter 8 of the second book of Enoch, describes a garden suspended between two heavens, guarded by a being whose name appears exactly once in the entire manuscript tradition, and never again. Scholars have translated this book for over a century. Copies exist in Old Slavonic, in fragments recovered from Qumran, in later Christianized redactions from Byzantine monasteries. Almost none of them agree on who that guardian actually is, what he is guarding against, or why the text goes quiet the moment it should be at its most triumphant. And the deeper you look into the third heaven, the less certain the answer becomes. If texts like this make you question what you thought you knew, hit subscribe now, because every week, we go back into the manuscripts the mainstream stopped reading closely a long time ago, and if you already have a theory forming, drop it in the comments. You might be onto something. Enoch is not shown heaven as a single place. He is carried upward, layer by layer, and each layer has its own function, its own population, its own rules, the way a building has floors, and each floor has a different purpose you only understand once you've walked through it. The third heaven sits between a heaven the text describes as administrative, populated by angels managing the mechanics of the world, and a heaven the text barely describes at all, almost as if the writer stopped himself mid-sentence and moved on. The third heaven is where Enoch is shown a garden, but it is not described the way paradise is usually described. There is no triumphant arrival. There is no chorus of the redeemed. There is a garden, a description of its layout, and then, almost as an afterthought, a guard. Enoch calls it the place prepared for the righteous, but the wording is careful, and careful wording in ancient religious texts is rarely accidental. Not a reward already given, a place prepared, waiting to be occupied, waiting to be completed. Two trees stand at its center, and the text lingers on their fragrance longer than it lingers on anything else in the entire chapter. Why linger on a smell? Why does a place of ultimate reward need its atmosphere described in such physical, almost clinical detail? A garden doesn't need defending unless something makes it worth defending. And the text tells us, almost in passing, buried in a subordinate clause rather than announced, that it is guarded. Most translations gloss over this detail entirely, treating it as incidental, but one manuscript tradition names the guardian directly, a single time, in a single verse, and the name does not match any of the archangels named elsewhere in the same book. Not Michael, who appears repeatedly across the Enochic corpus. Not Gabriel. Not Raphael, who guides Enoch through other regions of the cosmos in the wider tradition. A name that appears nowhere else in Enoch, nowhere else in the broader Enochic literature, and nowhere else in the surviving Second Temple period texts we have access to today. One appearance, then total silence for the rest of the manuscript history. Later Ge'ez and Slavonic copies either omit the name entirely or replace it with a generic phrase. An angel was set over it, stripped of any identity. That is not typically how scribes treat names in a religious manuscript. Names get preserved, even when garbled, even when misspelled through generations of hand copying. They rarely vanish outright and completely. Something about this particular name didn't survive the copying process the way everything else around it did. Was it a transcription error? A single tired scribe skipping a line? Was it a deliberate excision, someone deciding this detail shouldn't travel further? Or is it something stranger, a fragment of a tradition the copyists themselves no longer understood, and simply smoothed over rather than risk getting wrong? Nobody has a confirmed answer, and the specialists who have looked closely tend to disagree with each other more than they agree. Before we go further, if this is the kind of pattern you find yourself chasing at 1 in the morning, cross-referencing manuscript names nobody else seems to be talking about, subscribe and like this video right now. It tells the algorithm to keep putting this kind of research in front of the people who actually want it. And I want to know, do you think a name like this gets lost by accident, or does something get lost on purpose? Say what you think in the comments below. The souls placed in the third heaven are not the perfected, and they are not the ordinary dead described as waiting in other layers of the Enochic afterlife tradition. Second Enoch specifies a category, and the specificity is the point. Those who endured suffering for righteousness while alive, and were not delivered from that suffering before death. Not the sinless, not the martyrs in the dramatic, public sense either. Something narrower, something more particular, a category the text defines with more precision in its original language than any English translation has ever fully captured. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. Not the good, not the faithful, a very specific condition, suffering endured, righteousness maintained, and no resolution reached before the person died. An unfinished story, carried upward exactly as it was left. The garden holds them in what the text calls a waiting condition, not a final one. That distinction matters more than it first appears to. If the third heaven were the end of the story, the final destination, the last stop, there would be no reason to guard it. You don't post a guardian at the end of a road where nothing else can happen. You post one where something is still in transit, still unfinished, still capable of being reached from somewhere outside. Which raises an uncomfortable question the text never directly answers, and never even seems to attempt to answer. Reached by what, exactly? What could threaten a garden already inside heaven itself? Immediately above the third heaven, the text becomes noticeably less detailed, and the shift is abrupt enough that it's hard to miss once you notice it. Where the writer spends paragraph after paragraph describing gardens, fragrances, layouts, and populations, the account of the heaven directly above shifts almost overnight into short, guarded, almost procedural language, as though the writer knew more than he was willing to put down. Some translators have suggested this is simply a gap in the source material, damage sustained somewhere across centuries of copying. Others have pointed out that this exact pattern, vivid, confident detail followed by sudden, unexplained vagueness, repeats at several other sensitive points across the wider Enochic tradition, almost like a fingerprint. Is it damage? Or is it restraint? Here's what almost never gets discussed on camera, because it requires sitting with the actual grammar rather than the smoothed-over English. The single verse naming the guardian uses a grammatical construction found nowhere else in the manuscript, a phrase some specialists read as, "the one who was set to keep them from leaving," and others read as, "the one who was set to keep them from being taken." Two readings, two completely different implications, and they point in opposite directions. One version guards the garden from the souls inside it, keeping them contained. The other guards the souls inside it from something outside, keeping something else out. The manuscripts do not resolve which reading is correct, and the ambiguity itself has never been fully explained by anyone who has worked closely with the source text. If that distinction just made the hair on your arms stand up a little, good. It should. Hit subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment telling me which reading you believe, guarding them in, or guarding them from something else entirely. I read every single one. Second Enoch never returns to this guardian by name again, not once. In any surviving recension, the souls in the garden are mentioned later only in passing, still waiting, still unnamed as individuals, still described only by their category, never by who they were. No later chapter explains what they are ultimately waiting for. No later chapter explains what the guardian's presence is actually protecting against. And no later chapter explains why this particular heaven, of all the layers Enoch is shown, is the one where the text goes quiet at exactly the moment it should be at its most triumphant. A place of reward, guarded like a place of risk. A name given once, in a single verse, and then withheld for the rest of recorded history. Maybe it's a copying error, 15 centuries old, the kind of small accident that happens thousands of times across a manuscript tradition and usually means nothing. Maybe it's a detail an editor somewhere along the line thought was too specific to leave in, and quietly smoothed away. Or maybe the writer knew something about what stands between the third heaven and the one above it that he didn't fully want written down for anyone who came after him to find. The manuscript doesn't tell us which. It just leaves the guardian standing there, nameless again, exactly where the text left him, 2,000 years ago. So I'll leave you with the same question the scribes apparently couldn't answer either. Was that guardian placed there to keep something out, or to keep something in? Tell me what you think in the comments. I read all of them,